Hello, I'm Rob, and welcome to Alternatives to, where we look at an upcoming video game and suggest some alternatives that you can play in addition to, or instead of, or alongside said game. Now, our suggestions might be obvious, they might be a little bit left field, it all depends on the game. In this episode, we're looking at Cyberpunk 2077, which is developed by CD Projekt Red. Not that I needed to tell anyone that. It's a game that's due out very, very soon. Wishful thinking, barring any delays. And it's probably the most hyped game of this year, if not one of the most hyped games in the history of video games. Before we go any further, I should point out that this is not a review. I repeat, this is not a review, so we don't have any kind of inside scoop or anything like that. This is just based on what we've seen, what we've heard from CD Projekt Red with regards to Cyberpunk 2077 and some of the history of the game. Speaking of which, that's probably a good place to start. A lot of people are probably already aware of the history of Cyberpunk 2077, how it started as a tabletop RPG by Mike Pondsmith back in 1988, and how Mike Pondsmith was brought on board as a development consultant in 2012 by CD Projekt Red. That's probably stuff that people are already aware of, but I just want to bring it up because it does inform some of the choices that I've made, and some of the more obvious choices that could have made this list I have removed. So things like Deus Ex, in fact the entirety of the Deus Ex franchise, including Mankind Divided and Human Revolution, the adaptations of things like Blade Runner or Neuromancer or The Matrix, things like that I've avoided on purpose because they're too obvious as examples, and even things like Watch Dogs I've avoided because the whole hacking element, I've basically put that to one side as well. Primarily because, again, it's one of the more obvious choices. I think that if you're only picking the obvious choices, then you've only really scraped the surface of the cyberpunk science fiction genre. There are a lot of ways you can go, there are a lot of ways you can branch out from Cyberpunk 2077. One of the reasons why you can do that is because of its roots, its origins in tabletop RPGs. Now, in Cyberpunk 2077, we know it's a first-person perspective action adventure game, and we know there's a lot of customization in the game. You start as a mercenary whose voice, face, hairstyle, body type, modifications, background, and clothing, all of it is customizable. There are a lot of options with regards to what you do in Night City. There are various vehicles you can choose. You can have various classes like Netrunner, Techie. You've got all sorts of things that you can do with regards to your time in Night City. And one of the more fascinating aspects of Cyberpunk 2077 that I am really looking forward to is just exploring Night City. That was an element of the game that I think has been downplayed a lot. Exploring a new environment, exploring a new city is something that a lot of people do, but they don't really regard it as something that's important. But for me, it's incredibly important to get a feel for the environment that people have made, because there is a lot of stuff, there are a lot of side missions, there are a lot of characters to meet, and it's really interesting to see just how much effort the developers have made in building this world. World building is the start of any story, including ones that you make yourself. That's one of the things that I am fascinated by, and that basically leads to my first choice, which is another cyberpunk science fiction game, and it came out earlier this year on PC in April, and it came out again on consoles in around October time, I think it is, and that game is Cloudpunk. Now, Cloudpunk, which is developed by Ionlands, is a bit of a strange mixture of things. It is a science fiction cyberpunk game. You play as a delivery driver in this futuristic, towering, rotting city, and you work for an illegal delivery company called Cloudpunk. There are various characters that you can meet, and you only really have two roles. Make sure you never miss the delivery and never look in the package, which sounds a bit like that Transporter movie by Jason Statham, which may or may not have had some influence on this game. Now, the city itself, it towers above the clouds, but the further down you go, the more rotten it becomes, the more grimy, the more seedy it becomes. and you can explore different levels of the city. There are loads of different characters to meet, but the art style itself takes a bit in getting used to because it's a 3D pixel type thing. But one of the most fascinating aspects of Cloudpunk, and one of the things that really sets it apart as an indie game, is just how populated the city feels. When you are driving around the city, when you're exploring the city, sometimes in between deliveries and sometimes you're making a delivery, so you have to travel from one level of the city to another. There's a verticality to the city which you don't really find in many other city-based environments. You can explore different areas of the city, like the posh area, the grimy area. There's loads of different avenues you can go down. And I really love the game for its exploration aspect. There's the main storyline that you can play through, but there's also some really informing side quests as well, which actually help make the city feel lived in. And that's what I'm hoping to see in Cyberpunk 2077. Moving on to the next choice, and this one also has its roots in being a science fiction cyberpunk tabletop RPG. This one came around in 1989, and it was adapted into a video game in 1993 originally, but then it was readapted as a video game in 2013. So yeah, you guessed it, I'm talking about Shadowrun. Specifically, I'm talking about Shadowrun Dragonfall, rather than Shadowrun Returns. Now, I know when Shadowrun Returns came out in 2013, there were a lot of eyes on it because it was a Kickstarter project and so many people were still questioning whether Kickstarter could actually fund a successful video game, which it did. Shadowrun Returns was a success. Shadowrun Dragonfall, on the other hand, in particular the director's cut of Shadowrun Dragonfall, which is a standalone game, it was originally an expansion for Shadowrun Returns, but now it's just its own thing. It's an isometric CRPG, and if you want the complete Shadowrun experience without playing the tabletop RPG, then I think Shadowrun Dragonfall is the place to start. Now, it's very different in terms of perspective to Cyberpunk. It's isometric rather than first person, but there are a lot of choices you can make in terms of customization in Shadowrun, and unlike Shadowrun Returns, you actually have a team to work with. There's a lot of dialogue, there's a lot of talking. There isn't really any voice acting in the game, it's all text-based. The nice thing about that is it has allowed harebrained schemes to really build the dialogue choices, to really make the choices matter as well as you play through the game. You have some control over the direction that your team takes in terms of their customizations, but not as complete as your own customizations, how you develop as a character. And the game isn't set in kind of a futuristic seedy Seattle. It is set in Berlin after the collapse of the European Union, when the rest of Europe kind of regressed into city-states, which is kind of reflective of ancient Greece, but we're not going to go into that. Shadowrun is set in a world where magic and science and cyberpunk all clash and combine and merge, and in this world you don't just have humans, you have elves and dwarves and trolls and orcs. You have various classes, some of which actually parallel quite well with Cyberpunk 2077. In a lot of ways, Shadowrun Dragonfall is the complete version of what Shadowrun could be. It took a lot of what Shadowrun Returns tried to do and built on it. It made it less of a linear narrative. It allowed you to have a complete team. There were various improvements on the original game which made it a much more complete experience. And it's one of those games where it would easily rival the likes of XCOM and Wasteland. It's the kind of game that if Cyberpunk 2077 doesn't work for you for whatever reason, and I'm not judging you if the game doesn't work for you, everyone has their own tastes. I'm just saying that if Cyberpunk 2077 just doesn't work for you for whatever reason, but you want something Cyberpunk to play, then Shadowrun Dragonfall, the director's cut, is a good place to look. It is a very, very good game, and it's well worth all the plaudits that it gets. Which leads me to my third choice, and this is a game where choices actually matter. In fact, it's a franchise where choices historically have mattered. I'm not going to pick one specific game out of the franchise, rather I'm going to talk about the original trilogy of Mass Effect, not Andromeda. I'm not including that, so don't worry. Just the original trilogy. Specifically Mass Effect 2, but in the broadest sense, all 3 games. Mass Effect 2 is as close to perfection as I've seen a video game get in terms of how it has a branching narrative, how the dialogue choices and the choices that you make within the game actually matter and have consequences. BioWare crafted something that, barring a few minor gripes, it was almost perfect. It built on what Mass Effect did, improved on its flaws. Mass Effect 3 had its issues. I'm not going to go into them. Obviously, you all know the history of Mass Effect. You play as Commander Shepard. Now, you can choose your gender and how you look and stuff like that. There's all sorts of choices to make. There's a lot to Mass Effect, and there's a lot to recommend about Mass Effect. And the fact that it's getting remastered for the new generation of consoles is something to look forward to in the new year. You may have finished playing Cyberpunk by then. So, Mass Effect is my final choice. Let us know what you think about the choices that we've made for our alternatives to Cyberpunk 2077 in the comments below. We are always interested in finding out what people think. And if you have any other alternatives to Cyberpunk 2077, suggest them away in the comments. We'd love to hear what you all think, and our choices are by no means definitive. If you liked the video, then give us a thumb, a sub, or a bell. And if you want to support us, then check out our Patreon. The details are in the description. If you're after more video game chit-chat, then subscribe and join us every Thursday for Impossible Mission. And that's all for this episode, and indeed for this year. We'll be back next year with some more alternatives to up-and-coming video games. Until then, thanks for watching.